Hey, we're indoors because it is cold outside in the UK, and we're going to be working on this. Stage one is going to be the paint chipping. Simple and easy with a brush. Let's get to it. All right, so getting down to it, these are the colours that I'm going to be using. Yes, I said this is a cheap process to do this, and you will see here is a miniature paint, but honestly, this silver has such incredible coverage. When you mix it with other colours, it goes absolutely miles on your terrain and is totally worth it. And here's my test piece. So what I'm going to do is do two different ways of doing it. We're going to do a silvery metal effect on this one with the chipping, and we're going to do a more rusted and old and dirty effect on this piece to give you an idea of the two different ways of doing it. So aside from your paints, you want a palette to work on. I've got my slightly skanky ended stippling brush, something small that actually works really well, and I've got off camera my water, adding a little bit of dish soap or fairy liquid or washing soap to your water will really help here with the flow, and because we're going to use a stippling process, it will make sure you don't get nasty tide marks or texture in your paint where you don't want it. Right, just for base coating this, I'll mix these together to make a dark metallic, and you'll see just what I mean, that the silver goes a long way in setting up the dark metal. I mean, look, all of that black was still tinted to a nice gunmetal tone by the silver, and I'm just going to put this on in a rough base coat on the metallic areas, and we'll do the brown on the other piece. And a quick pro tip, I've got to do some more metallic basing later, so let's not waste that. Pop a little base over the top, and that makes sure it doesn't dry out by this evening. So it's a good idea where your brown's still wet to come in with your orange and start stippling it in places. And again, don't worry if it looks really messy. This is an intermediate stage. We're going to be doing quite a lot more here. You can be super messy. If you want to use a sponge to do this, it does look a little better, but I had this brush to hand. And just to demonstrate the point, we get some oranges on there. Where they blend like this, you get a nice mid-tone colour. Then you can go back in again with a bright orange for some bright spots. You don't want too many. You want the rust to look nice and old where it does show, but a little bit of orange goes a long way. Okay, no fancy oil washes or Agrax Earthshade, etc. this time round. We're just going to get a little bit of our soap-containing water and knock up a wash from what's left over of the base coating paints. And you don't have to be too fussy here. And then we're just going to slap that on the metallic-y bit here. So we'll go over with a black wash. And you can see the soap just helps it settle in the recesses a little bit better than plain old thin down black paint will do. You get a little less tide marking, which is always good. But again, we're going for stages of work here. So this will be absolutely fine. And then we'll go in and get some brown. A little bit of black still in the water kind of helps. And we'll put that in some places along the bottom here, just to kind of break it up a little bit. It doesn't have to be too fancy. Again, once this dries, because the soap and the volume of water, it'll all nicely blend. And then we want to get the black on the wall because the wall's got a brown base. So we'll just go over like that. It'll mute down the orange a little bit. So see how it is once it's dried, because it's quite thin, this coat. It doesn't look it here, but it will do once it dries. And then if it needs a little touch of orange for a pop of brightness, you can just tap a little bit more back on, and then you're good to go for the next stage. Right, so the thing to add about this paint process is that we're not going for a realistic style paint chipping. That was the previous way of doing things. This is a lot more dramatic in the way it gets its effects through contrast. So I've gone on with a little bit of orange on the edges, which will be the bits where watery rust would gather, but we're going for a bit of an impact here. This is a little dark now that I've gone over it. I really like how it looks. It just needs a bit of a pop for the purpose of the painting process. So can't beat a good dry brush on metallics. So this silver, again, this Vallejo stuff is amazing for dry brushing, and I'm going to be quite stark with the dry brushing, and you'll see why when I get onto the next stage. But dry brushing it on like this to give a real pop. You can stipple it in places, but largely some of this might just get covered over. You've got to not worry about what you might cover over and just kind of go for a nice bold look. So yeah, there you go. We've got a nice highlight on there now, nice amount of contrast between the recesses and the edges, and give that a second to dry, and we'll come in and do the actual chipping. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to get our red, is the first one I'm going to go for, and you probably have to do a couple of coats with these craft paints. If you do have miniature paints to use, you will get better coverage, but obviously we're going here for a more budget approach. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a tapping stippling motion, but I'm not going to get the edges. So I'm going to leave the paint showing. So if I do it here, and we're really rough about this, it will start to look a bit funny at first, but don't worry, you've got to kind of see the process through. So here, I'm just tapping it in the middle of this area of the model here. We can go for heavy chipping by only putting a little bit on, or we can go for some, you know, relatively unchipped paint here by applying quite a lot. So it's kind of the reverse of what you're doing. The more paint you're putting on, the less chipping is going to be present. And again, it's not necessarily about the realism, i.e. the recesses here. Normally paint would stay there because there's no physical abrasion. But what we're going to do is leave them as a dividing line between the different red areas to add a bit of a pop. So again, I'm using water that's got a little bit of dish soap in it. It just helps the paint spread a little better. And again, these craft paints need a little bit more coverage, but that actually kind of lends itself to a good look, because they're going to end up with a little bit of texture around the edges, which for the actual chipped paint is exactly what you want, because you want it to look like it's kind of peeling and getting ruined. And already we can kind of see that there. It's a little glossy at the moment where it's wet, so let's come back and take a look at what it comes up like when it's dry. Okay, some lessons to myself here doing this process. It looks significantly better on metals with an obvious metal finish than it does on the dirty, grimy metals. I think that here, I think it looks pretty good with the heavy rusted edges. That looks nice. Here with the darker metallic rust edges doesn't look so good, so I would either do bright orange rusting, which also looks good here, or I really would personally be sticking with this in the future, where you've got this highly highlighted dirty metal with a high highlight here. Looks really good in terms of the paint looking like it's peeling off on the corners here, especially on these edges where we've concentrated the paint here. And this here is the craft paint. You can see that it's not got as good a finish, but it's still done a pretty good job. Once you put a wash over this, honestly, it's going to look good. But it looks much better if you do want to use the miniature paints. And I think this might actually be worth the extra. You know, they're a couple of quid a bottle more. This is Mephiston Red, and this is 2 coats of coverage, which has gotten really good coverage. You can see right in there with the way the paint chipping has worked on the edges, looks really good. Whereas you get up close personal with the craft one, not as good, and took 4 coats to get to that point. So I think this is definitely the way to go, but you can see how nice that looks. And what I'll do is I'll blend that with another colour's worth of chipping, and you can see how it looks really, really good in making the paint look peeled back. Okay, I've gone on with a second colour, like I said, and here I put black on, and I've deliberately not covered up the red. So here it looks like you've got a second paint where the primer underneath, the red here, is showing along with the chipped edges, and these two in combination with each other, especially at tabletop distance, looks like a really good chipped edge look, and I really like how it looks here where the paint's rubbed off the top edge. So next up we're going to do some budget friendly rust work. Okay, so I'm coming in with a damp brush to start with, but not too wet to get the brown on there, and you're going to want to put this in the vast majority of the area you want to put the rust. So we're going to put some down here at the bottom, because this is where rusting would take place, at the bottom where the water gathers. So we're going to go in here like this. And once again here you see me using a tapping motion to get that stippling random edge. If you want to sponge the edges as well, that can add an extra level of realism, but right now just mainly getting the colour down. And while that's still slightly damp, we'll blend in a mixture of the orange and the brown together here, and here more in towards, again, the corner where the rust is going to concentrate, this sort of 50-50 mix here, and put this into the corner, and then we'll get a little bit of orange and really make it mostly orange, and just get that down here and give this a chance to dry before we do the last stage. Right, that's had a chance to dry, and you can see it's looking pretty good as far as rust goes, but we need a little bit more orange in there. So what I've got here is watered down orange, kind of like a wash consistency. And what we're going to do is, again, push this into the corners without being too accurate with it, like this here. And then this is thinned down again, so it's not going to dry this strongly. So you've got to remember that when you're doing these effects. And then what we'll do is we'll get some thick application of the rust paint. That's probably a little too much. And we'll just put that in the corner and in this edge here, and just push it into the corners, and it will slowly bleed out with the wetness that's here and give us a nice diffused effect. If you've got a super bright orange, like a miniature paint orange, that you want to then really jazz it up with, that's great. If not, you could add a little bit of yellow to this and just get it right in the recesses there for a final pop. And here we have it dried, so you can see where I've blended it to the orangey tone. This is a very big close-up here in the corners. It looks really nice, got that rust pop again. A brighter, really intense colour in the corner would be good if you have something to use. But from a table distance, that looks pretty nice. And just to show that the acrylic artists / craft paints weren't that bad really. I've done the same effect here. with the browns and oranges, and then put a bit of a wash over the top, and it's come out looking pretty good. Pretty happy with that for a cheapo paint option. And just to point out, the reason we did the work with the dark brown, I put just the orange rust up in the corner here, and you can see that it doesn't look anywhere near as realistic as it does with the creeping rust colour effect here. So yeah, for a really easy method, I'm super pleased with how these come out. You know what? I actually kind of do like the cheapo craft paint look now that it's not under my painting lights and it's kind of under the sort of light level I'd expect to be gaming with. I think it looks a little bit more organic than the miniature paints, but with both methods, take your choices. So come back next week and we'll take a look at how I did the rusting.